This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we are taking a deep dive into Fables, the new adventure module from Ghostfire Gaming, and we're also talking about digital tools in tabletop RPGs. All that and more coming up right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop role-playing game podcast in the world, without a doubt. With these panelists, I have James Hake, Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin. Sean, do you prefer digital dice or are you old school and prefer the physical dice? You have to have something in your hand.
I totally prefer the physical dice, but technically speaking, I can roll a 1 no matter what. So it really is the dealer's choice at this point in my gaming career.
Right, okay, fair enough. It's ones either way. I have a friend who thinks D&D Beyond has it in for him because every time he rolls a dice there, it's always less than 5 on a D20. Dale, what about you? Do you use digital or are you all physical?
I'm the same as Sean. I need an exorcism of some kind. I am definitely cursed no matter what dice I'm using, but for some reason, I feel like fate is a little bit on my side if I'm using physical dice. If I'm using a computer, I feel like the robots are out to get me.
That's what I thought. I would never have let digital dice at my game table a few years ago, but times have obviously changed. James Hake, have you changed with the times or kept using physical dice?
The robots are trying to woo me at the moment. I was playing in a game with my cousins yesterday, and the dice on D&D Beyond rolled better for me than they ever have before. I think in any game session of my entire life, I was slaughtering enemies out there. It's the game, the one game I play in where I'm a player instead of a DM, and so I think the dice were just trying to be a little bit nice to me, digitally, trying to win me over to their side. But no, most of the time I would say that my preference is far and away with the physical, tactile clackiness of real deal dice.
I have to agree. My one problem with physical dice is once you've rolled a metal dice, it's hard to go back. It feels like you're not rolling real dice when you go back to the plastic ones. They just feel like toy dice or fake because they're so light. Welcome, everybody, back to the Eldritch Lorecast. We haven't recorded together in a while, so this feels new and fresh for us again. But, of course, we're here every week, so make sure to catch us on YouTube or iTunes or Spotify, wherever you catch your podcasts, in to the weekly news, the weekly Ghostfire gaming news. And last week, we announced finally letting the public know that we can talk about it. James, this must be a huge relief for you that we can talk about Fables, which is our upcoming adventure subscription service, which is going to start in January of this year. James, you've been the lead writer on this, working on it for at least 6 months, if not longer than that. What can you tell us about it? What's the elevator pitch for Fables? What is the first adventure all about?
Well, I'm absolutely over the moon that we can finally talk about Fables and get it out in the open. So, okay, here's your elevator pitch. Fables is a monthly adventure subscription service that tells a story played episodically over 6 months, 4 sessions a month. Tells a complete story in a setting you're familiar with, and then when it's done, the story is concluded, wrapped tight with a bow. We leave it all behind, move on to a brand new setting, a brand new story, a brand new genre, and let you have at it again with another unique fable. This first one is set in what I would describe as familiar territory for a lot of the people listening to this podcast. If you're fans of Ghostfire Gaming, their flagship setting of Grim Hollow, the dark fantasy world, which I know Ben is a fan of. You were just talking about how this setting feels like it was custom made for you, Ben, even before you began working here at Ghostfire.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about Grim Hollow before I started here, and I was like, this just fits so well. I was telling everybody I uploaded a photo to my Instagram last night because I just got a staff order of all the Grim Hollow products that are currently on sale, and it felt like Christmas. I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. These miniatures are fantastic, but I don't want to focus too much on that.
Well, speaking of Christmas, I really do want it to feel like Christmas every time you get your new monthly release of Fables. It's like this. It's a little package of adventure content, everything you need to run this adventure. You bring the dice, you bring the pencil, you bring the paper, everything else you need to run this adventure, we give to you. Maps, tokens, handouts, anything that you could possibly want to run this first adventure. Citadel of the Unseen Sun, our flagship Fables release here, will be there for you on the very beginning of every month, starting January 1st, 2022.
Is it on the 1st? Like that's when it releases? First day of each month? Awesome.
Yes. Very first day of each month. We're going to start 2022 off right. It's been a hard couple of years for us over here. 2020 wasn't very good. 2021 was fighting hard to be better. But we're kind of hoping that 2022, with the release of a brand new Gigantor-sized Grim Hollow adventure, will... well, if 2022 is not any better, it'll look a lot better in comparison, I think, to everything that's going on in the Asturian Empire in this adventure.
Well, that's what I was going to say, right? 2022 will be a lot better for us as people, but for our D&D characters, maybe not so much. Maybe they've still got some trials and tribulations ahead of them.
Yes, exactly. I think that a lot of people in the company that I've talked to while making this adventure told me that they were really excited to see the Asturian Empire get its own sort of bespoke expansion because it's their favorite part of the setting. And when I first read the Grim Hollow campaign guide, when I joined the company, it was instantly what I gravitated to also. The idea that the sun itself has been plucked from the sky by an unknown ritual is fascinating to me. The fact that vampires immediately took this opportunity and streamed upward out of chasms in the earth that arose as a result of this dark magic was awesome. And the idea that there is an ancient necropolis of some unknown origin beneath the entire land from which all of these horrific undead emerged. I mean, it feels custom made for me in much the way that the rest of it feels custom made for you.
No, absolutely. I love the Crimson Court, which is sort of the monarchy or the nobility of the southern part of Astoria, where a lot of this adventure takes place. Because the thing I love about Etheris or Grim Hollow vampires is that they seem monstrous. You know, they're not the sort of dapper, nice vampires, although they masquerade as such. You know, we are the nobility. We're refined in our palates. We are, you know, we like the finer things in life. We rule, you know, the lands around us as kind civil nobles, but a lot of it, you know, they're almost deluding themselves, you know, like a lot of it is actually, no, they're bloodthirsty monsters that masquerade as being, you know, something more refined than that. And you get to, without giving too much away, in the latter parts of the adventure, you get to rub shoulders, so to speak, with the Crimson Court.
Yeah, well, I'm here to share as much as I feel comfortable with about the adventure. But I don't want to just monologue here. So I think the first thing that I want to say is that, Sean, you were instrumental to the creation of some of the new monsters that are going to be appearing in this product. And in fact, this was not really my intent, but Fables is going to, every single episode of our first Fable is going to be a sneak preview of the upcoming Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire that's going to be coming out in, what, March, April of this year?
Next year?
Yes, somewhere. Next year. Yeah, it will be next year. Speaking of a grand 2022.
A monstrous 2022, depending if you're a real person or a fictional character playing in a D&D campaign.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this goes back to when I started with Ghostfire Gaming in January of this year and started working on the player's guide and getting into starting to design some of the monsters. And everyone kept asking me, when will there be adventures? When will there be adventures? So I said to our leadership, when will there be adventures? And they said, just give us a minute. And then they shared with me this idea of Fables. And I thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful. Who are you going to get to lead this? Because this is going to be a large scale project. And they said, well, we're talking with James Hake. And I'm like, sold, done. This is going to be great. I can't wait. So as soon as James started, I sat down with him and said, let's talk about monsters. What monsters will you need that we can add to this book? We'll get the design started with them right away. And they are incredibly creepy, unique, wonderful, horrible monsters that will be carried over from the grimoire into Fable and back.
Yeah, they really run the gamut of horrific creepy and a little bit cute creepy also. There's our art director Zoe provided us with some illustrations to kind of throw up in editing while we're talking about all this. So I want to focus on two illustrations in particular. One is of the streets of Novostoya, which appears in one of the later episodes of this fable. You go to the city of gargoyles itself and kind of infiltrate a vampiric gala in order to get a piece of information that you desperately need to find the villain's lair.
I love a vampiric gala. I love a vampiric gala.
Oh, literal fountains of blood. Oh, literal fountains of blood.
Like I said, they believe they're refined, but in actuality,
they adore the excess. But there's a deep sort of stratification of the city of Novostoya. In the heights of the city, there are grand fetes and galas, and also these big parties kind of constantly, in which people are tapped for blood like you might tap a keg. But down below, in the low streets of Novostoya, this is a land where the sun never shines. So when people say don't go out at night, well, they mean don't go out at all. Because the only light you see are the lights of the crimson lanterns that hang in the streets, and prowling in the shadows at all times are vampires, their agents, or sometimes worst of all, they're gorehound trackers, these sort of monstrous, vampirically mutated bloodhounds that sniff out a target unerringly as they wind their way through the labyrinthine streets of the city. And I think those monsters are kind of among the more horrific ones, because it's not just that they look creepy. They have this sort of star-nosed mole appendage on the front of their canine faces. But it's just the thought of them. If you've seen It Follows,
right,
there's just something completely primevally upsetting about being stalked by something that you can't quite see at the periphery of your vision. There's something very human about it, right? Human beings evolved into what they are today because they're kind of endurance hunters. They don't sprint you down like a cheetah, but they will walk toward you menacingly for the better part of, a week until finally you collapse and they get you.
What was the process, because you touched on it, James, between you and Sean, or Sean, what was the process in terms of those monsters that are featured in Fables? Because these two projects were being worked on concordantly alongside each other. Was it, James, you going to Sean and saying like, oh, here's a monster concept we need? Or James, did you get the opportunity to kind of flick through the monster grimoire monsters as they were being worked on and being like, oh, I'll take that and I will take one of those and I will put them in here?
It was exactly as you said first. I identified 3 new monsters that I wanted for every episode of this fable.
Sure.
And I said, Sean, what do you think of these? What can your people do with these sort of 2-sentence descriptions, the basic outline of what they are, what their challenge rating is, and kind of what their monster typing is? And it was all him from there on out.
Yeah, and I took the description and I went to my team. One designer in particular, Bianca Bickford, did the lower CR creatures, and then they were so good that I couldn't farm them out. I had to work on a few myself. So the higher CR creatures came from me. We passed it through to our developer Chris Sims, who did his development pass. Incredibly gifted game designer and developer. And then we shipped the monsters to James for his final approval.
And for the most part, they went through perfectly clean. There, inevitably, there's going to be some disagreement between two different teams, and I think only one monster got a really significant change. There's a very sort of big, imposing, ring wraith-like entity that, when I described them as being sort of ring wraith-like, I kind of meant more in terms of story purpose. But I think got interpreted more as their magic and their appearance. And, that comes down to me, that comes down to, people not being able to read my mind. So obviously there was no fault on my end there.
Yeah, no, we can't cast detect thoughts in real life. If only.
So I took that back. Now, this is great. Let's just rename it, and the Monster Grimoire can have it, and I'll just sort of build something new for myself that's more like what I envisioned, but was unable to communicate properly in the first place.
Sean, did you have much insight into the Fables process as they were being written? It seems like Joey got to hang out in your house a fair bit. Did you, did you have any kind of input or suggestions about how things would unfold in the Fables based on the monsters as they were being fed through to him?
I was able to go through James's outline and saw the story that he was planning to tell, and if I had seen anything that raised any alarms, I would have definitely spoken up. But everything seemed to be spot on, so I just got out of the way and let James do his magic.
For sure.
Yeah. It's my ardent hope that, a game designer as good as you are, Sean, you and I will have the chance to actually really link arms and do something together in the future. But this one, it was enough to get the line started, So, sometimes you just need to put your head down and power through it and get things ready. And then once it's out in the world, once the butterfly has spread its wings and is beginning to fly, then we can start getting creative.
Well, in January, it will spread its wings out. Just quickly worth noting for people, because there have been a couple of questions that have come in from the community since Fables has been announced. I want to ask one of you in a minute, Joey. But first, just quickly worth noting that when it releases, it'll be, I think, $14.99 US for each installment. But if you go and subscribe to it before January, you can get it for $9.99 for 12 months. So the first 6 Fables will be at $9.99 for you, and then after that, maybe I've given the game away a little bit already. Although, no, you mentioned at the start, James, that there will be other adventures to come in future. But for this first one, this 6-month Citadel of the Unseen Sun, what level characters are they going to start at, and where will they sort of end up? Because you've talked about low CR monsters and higher CR monsters. Where are they starting when the adventurers first begin?
Yeah, so this Fable begins at first level and progresses through 13th level by its end. And actually, the next Fable we're working on, because we're doing simultaneous design, is going to be in the same level range also. Ultimately, that's something I'd like to play with. I'd like to do campaigns that have a really slow level progression, or that have a really specific high level progression, or just like something that shakes up the formula just a little bit. But starting here at the very ground floor, it only made sense to me to start with first level characters and take them as high as we could.
Yeah, for sure. And what's the leveling like? Is it just sort of, standard XP as they go through, or are there milestones that are laid out in the adventure?
Every single episode has specific milestone goals towards leveling you up. I'm sure they could be played XP style, but from the very beginning, the design of Fables was to have a really good story being told. And if we want to do a mega dungeon product, for example, that might be a great time to do an XP advancement system. But it's something that Ghostfire, I think, could do. But it's not what Fables is about.
For sure. Dale, when you're running campaigns, are you generally leveling up people slower, or are you 6 months, 1 to 13 is generally a standard run for you?
I feel like I do it at a fairly paced sort of narrative. I tend to use milestone as well. So, I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that my players definitely have a grasp on their characters' abilities that they got last level, and I want to make sure that we hit a narrative beat and then they're going to level up. But no matter what I do, it seems like it's not quick enough for some of my players. They're like, we've been here for too long. Like we go, it's been 2 sessions. Simmer down. So, I feel like I'm doing it at a pretty pace, but, take that up with Daniel at my table.
I think one interesting thing.
Yeah, calling you out, Daniel.
Jeez. Poor Daniel.
As long as we're on the topic of pace, I think I'm interested to see what people think about this first Fable, because looking at it in hindsight as I move forward, first of all, it's weird for me to be kind of moving forward as we're just releasing the very first one, right? Like I've already learned my lessons from Citadel. And I'm sure I'll learn more once all of you listening out there get your hands on it and start sharing it in the Discord and on social media and that sort of thing. I'm excited to hear from you. But in terms of game design, Citadel of the Unseen Sun is huge. It's a little overstuffed, is what I would say. So it's all good content, but this first Fable is definitely a big product. You'll be getting more than your expected bang for your buck, just in terms of how much adventure you're getting.
For sure. I think that sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just trying to say it in a way that doesn't seem like a bad thing, because future Fables after this one will have less content. Sure. But that's exclusively a good thing. I think people hear more content, they think good, and in many cases that's true. But for what we're working on next, you'll see. I think you'll see how the process is already evolving and being refined, and how we can get even more out of less.
For sure.
I'll let that hang in the air.
I'm also really interested about this idea of, it's a 6-month, adventure. This is you're taking your characters and every week you play the game, and after 6 months you've had your campaign, right? Like that's very interesting to me, sort of setting out from the get-go expectations of what the pace will be and of the campaign length. We've talked previously on this podcast about how we would like to reinforce the idea that a campaign need not be level 1 to level 20. And it's nice seeing sort of a system in place, a structure in place that encourages that, but in a fun way.
Yeah, absolutely. These stories are all very self-contained, with a very clear beginning and a clear end. With the way I've described it is that every chapter knows where it starts and knows where it ends, but it doesn't have any idea about how you'll get there. That's kind of, I've talked about it on this very podcast. That's my ideal way of playing D&D. And I think this style will resonate with a lot of people out there, is that there's a strong scenario in place, and I don't care how you resolve it, but we know that it will get resolved in some way. And the choices you make along the way will resonate and echo throughout the story in many ways, and also throughout just who your characters become as they deal with it. If you watch the trailer for Citadel of the Unseen Sun, which has been out for about a week now, you'll hear one of the characters, one of the members of this group of survivors called the Dredgers, who you'll meet in the very first episode, asking you what you'll sacrifice to get what you want, to earn your freedom, to earn your emancipation from this destiny. And I think that's a question that people should have in their minds throughout the entire play experience. What will you be willing to sacrifice? Who will you be willing to sacrifice? There are a lot of very lovable NPCs in this adventure.
Yeah, I love that.
Will you let them die? Because this is not an easy adventure. These combat encounters are real nasty. If I'm being totally honest with you, you're going to have to beg, borrow, and steal, use every resource available at your disposal in order to get through them. And in the very first episode, I think the players will realize that this is a dark fantasy game. They're going to have to make hard decisions, and sometimes the resources at your disposal are people that you care about very, very much. And you gotta decide if your character is okay with that, or if they aren't, how they will deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's sacrifice is a linchpin of dark fantasy. And part of the reason I love the genre so much is because, I can't remember if I've talked on this podcast before or not, but about the concept that, true heroism is about sacrifice, or whether your character is doing it for heroic reasons or not. You might play Fables and you make those sacrifices purely out of your own personal self-gain. And we've talked about the alignment chart before. But, true heroism is being put in a tough situation and trying to get the best result for everyone, which might require personal sacrifice, or it might require sacrifice of somebody else. And we're about to fall down a morality
trolley
rabbit.
Problems.
Yeah,
trolley problems
exactly.
all the way down.
But I
Yes,
think
indeed.
that having read a bit of the Fables, and in terms of you talking before, James, about it being very packed with content over the course of 6 months to get through the entire thing, it really epitomizes, I think, or encapsulates what you were talking about in the very first episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, where we talked about streams and pools as an adventure design philosophy. And if you want to play through the Fables and just kind of slam through it and get through each chapter in that single month that the chapter's released to get onto the next chapter and keep the story moving at a click, you can play it that way. But there is also those pools, those areas where the party will kind of fall into and be able to go in multiple different directions and choose which stream they want to go off the current pool into. Or, there is plenty of room in there, I think, for DMs to also, or GMs to also invent. And, if the players go off in some unpredicted direction, the GM can be like, well, here's this thing here as well. And there's room in there for those GMs that like to take a module and then twist it and change it to their own needs. Because the thing is, I know that you've talked about Citadel of the Unseen Sun is a fairly on-flowing story. It sort of has a beginning, middle, and end, and each chapter feeds into the next one. But at the same time, they can be taken out individually and almost run as one-shots if you just recontextualize them a bit, or you change the location or the setting. I'm someone who really liked to take Faerun adventures and then put them in my own homebrew and recontextualize them that way. So there is that capacity for an invention there.
Yeah, there's a great deal of breadth in the type of story content that this fable covers. For example, the very first chapter of this fable, episode 1, chapter 1, which kicks off the adventure and will in fact be released as a free trial version of the fable once it's up on the website, is a nice, simple one-shot session dungeon crawl that inevitably ends with a total party kill. All of the player characters die. They're annihilated by the adventure's villain. And they awaken in the next chapter in where the story flows on. And that is sort of a thing that might be worth, if you want to run this adventure, talk with your party about it. It's a kind of like, you have to trust that they will buy into the plot hook. Right. If Bilbo didn't want to go with Gandalf and the dwarves, then there would be no The Hobbit. But conversely, and I should say that I think at the beginning of a D&D adventure, where sometimes you just need to get a story moving, doing something like that, as long as the players kind of know what's happening, is a pretty okay thing. It's like starting them out in jail. Your story starts you in jail, and that's the jailbreak, and that's the session. On the other hand, once the adventure really gets moving, in chapter 4, you find yourself out in this big sort of open world exploration of of the Asturian Empire, the fields of Soma itself. And there are all these places you can go, and all these sort of various quests you can do, and NPCs you can find, towns to visit, all before you make it to the city of Nova Astoria itself. And this is very sort of open-ended, free-flowing, open-world stuff. And that's exactly where it ought to be, right? A story starts off very constricted at the beginning, where the players kind of, there's a story to tell, so we got to get in on it. And then it opens up to a really broad, large-bellied space in the middle, where it's like, okay, how can our choices drive where the adventure is going? And then it kind of tapers off again at the end, where it's like, okay, and now we come into the climax, and we hit it hard. And for this story, at least, that's the way we want it to go. In my opinion, if you buy a D&D adventure, you buy it because there's a story that wants to be told there. And I believe that as an adventure writer, I should trust the dungeon master to know their players and know their party. And so I will lay out in no uncertain terms what the story I have in my mind is, and know that if they don't want to abide by it, there's nothing wrong with that. I won't get hurt feelings if you decide to veer off from the story that I've begun writing. In fact, I'll be delighted. I'll be delighted that you've decided to take this unique aspect of our RPG medium and say, yeah, let's do our own thing with it. But I feel as a writer, it's incumbent upon me to write a good story first and foremost, and then you can take it wherever you want to after that.
Well, Fables will be available, like you said, James. The first chapter is dropping January 1st, and there is a little sneak peek that's coming before then. If you want to get more information about it, there'll be a link down in the description, but you can also go to ghostfiregaming.com, and I think it's like the main banner on the website at the moment. $14.99 a month for each chapter as they come out, but if you go and subscribe right now, you'll get them all for $9.99 for the first 12 months. So go check it out. I think it's fantastic. I'm actually really looking forward to, no pun intended, sinking my teeth into the lore and getting a closer look at Astoya, the Crimson Court, and Nova Astoya, especially because the campaign guide and the player's guide give really great, the Grim Hollow ones I'm talking about, give really great sort of overviews of the whole world of Etheirys, but this is going to really drill down and take a closer look and really start to unpack these realms a bit closer. So at the top of this episode, we talked very briefly about digital dice versus physical dice, because for fairly obvious reasons, digital tools have become an increasing part of, the way that we play tabletop role-playing games. Obviously, there's D&D Beyond, which has its own digital dice roller, which is sort of what I had in mind when I was asking that question. But just recently, I think it was announced either last week or the week before, that Pathfinder are launching sometime in the near future, Pathfinder Nexus, which is sort of their answer to D&D Beyond, which I think is great because those digital tools make the game so much more accessible to a lot of new players that are coming into it. Dale, do you use a lot of those digital tools at your table? Are they ubiquitous for you as they are for me?
I'm a terrible example of this. I don't love playing digitally. I think it's great that we have the tools to. I love that so many people love it. It's not for me, but I think that's because one of my favorite parts of the game is the table talk. I love that I'm focused on this person over here who's doing something personal for just their character. And I tune in and I realize that everyone else at the table has been continuing to talk in character, and that's something that gets lost in digital spaces, but I am learning to embrace them. I've been a player in a digital sort of ongoing adventure with Matt Colville and the MCDM friends. We've been playing a game of 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons using Fantasy Grounds, and so I've had to learn to embrace all of those tools. And it is interesting that the more you use them, the more second nature they become, right? Like learning a video game for the first time. You just pick it up and then you don't have to think about it at all. So I'm slowly embracing it. I've always been very, very pleased that they exist, because I think that it's an incredible tool for people who maybe don't have a million friends around them who want to play D&D. Maybe you live in a small town and your pool of options is limited. So having this, global aspect to it, the fact that I can play D&D with people who are in the USA is huge. So I am a big fan of the existence of digital tabletops, even if I, on the surface, am not the person who loves using them.
But do you find that they're creeping into your physical games as well? Because 3 years ago we had one player at my table who used D&D Beyond on his iPad, and we all had our physical character sheets, and we were laughing at him going like, check out this new age guy, and it would be like, oh, what's your, what does this spell do, or what's your skill that you're using? He'd be like, hang on a second, I'm just like clicking through, because he hadn't used it before. So we were like, physical character sheets all the way. Fast forward 3 years, and even in the physical space, the in-person space, I find that most players at my tables, as an average, are using something like D&D Beyond, even if it isn't specifically D&D Beyond, for their character sheets, their magic item tracking, their hit points, all that sort of thing. Do you find they're sneaking into the physical realm?
Not in my games so much. I play in one physical game where one player uses D&D Beyond a lot and uses their laptop in general. They have, a separate app for note keeping, and they've got D&D Beyond up at all times. One player in my game did briefly try to use his D&D Beyond in my campaign, but I think he struggled a little bit getting used to it, and then gave up and used the physical sheets. But I suspect that it's again that practice element, right? So many of my players are just so used to using the physical sheets that they're not going to bother. I think from my perspective, it's a little bit of that barrier that comes from additional costs. So D&D Beyond is wonderful. It's got a lot of great factors, but the fact that you maybe pay for a subscription in order to have access to more than 6 characters, the fact that you have to repurchase products that you maybe already own in real life. You own the player's handbook, but if you're going to use that stuff here, then you're going to have to pay for it again. And it's that tension, I think, between things that are in place as protections and, because of copyright law and all sorts of things, sort of legal protections, versus, there is a cost factor that I think gets ignored a lot of the time. It's a big thing for me. I always think that you should only need one book, right? That was a big sticking point for me getting into Dungeons and Dragons specifically, was this idea that is so prevalent that you need 3 books. If you're going to run the game, you need the player's handbook, the monster manual, and the DM's guide. That for me, I was like, that's absurd, because I started with, Pathfinder and Iron Kingdoms and these games that just throw it all into the one book. And yeah, there's other things that you can buy, but everything you need to run it is here. So it's a one-off purchase, and you can kind of excuse that. And I did bring this up on Twitter at one point, which we all know Twitter is the greatest place on the internet for discussion, and a lot of people were sort of saying things like, in terms of Australian dollars, I don't know what it is US, but in terms of Australian dollars, I was saying this is 3 books at $60 each, and not everyone can afford that. And people were sort of saying, it's only $60. It's only $60. Of course, you can put aside enough money to save to buy this book. This is me getting on a bit of an economical tangent, but I think that it is very telling that people have begun to think of it as only $60. I think that there is a very genuine barrier to being able to buy all these books, and then the idea of having to purchase them again for use with digital tools, I think does act as a bit of a barrier, even just if someone is a little bit miserly. I know I'm a little bit miserly, and maybe some of my players are too, and so that idea of, well, I've already got it here, why should I pay to have it over there again?
Well, I suppose the devil's advocate argument, and I know some people hate that term, but the other way around argument, if you want to use a less contentious term, is that D&D Beyond lowers a barrier for entry because you don't need to purchase the player's handbook if you don't want it, and you can just purchase things through D&D Beyond, and also you can kind of purchase a la carte as well, I think is the right term.
Absolutely,
if you have a specific magic item or a feat or class abilities, I think you can buy the classes like individually. That allows a player who's just getting into the game to invest, either nothing or a small amount. Yeah. And the weight of the cost rests with the other players who bring their player's handbook and whatever who are already playing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I do think that is something definitely worth noting. So for a lot of people who are just coming into it now, this is a great way to get into tabletop role-playing games, is if they have a digital option for you, because you can do things like that. You can lower the cost. You can, pick and choose what you want and you need. But for players who predate that digital system in some capacity, particularly if we're looking at Pathfinder, it's got this really strong core audience of supportive fans. Those are people who've already bought the books and are kind of going, why don't I just play it on Roll20?
Sure.
I think it's a good tool. I think it's a powerful tool. I think it's going to be great for getting new people into it. But I do think that there is this contention that arises because you've got kind of the pre-existing players as well as the ones who will be coming into it.
There are so many great topics that we just discussed, or that could be discussed from this. One,
so many.
I just got back from a convention. So, an in-person convention where I would say at least 60 to 70% of the players at the table were not using books or character sheets. They were using their phones, tablets, or laptops. You can, on D&D Beyond, if you're running a campaign, share the books that you've purchased with all of your players. So right there, if you want to team up with your players, it's better than passing around one hard copy of a book. You can be online and all sharing the same thing, and seeing what other people, are doing with their characters if you're the DM. In terms of how important digital is to the game, we talk about why is 5e doing so well. Some people say, well, because it's a great rule set. Some people say it's just the right time. We have just the right time, just the right audience. Some people say it's because of streaming. People can watch the game being played. There's a fourth prong to this, that is, with all these digital tools, you don't have to carry around 27 books all the time. So, this digital revolution in role-playing games is a topic worth 5 shows.
Yeah, well, there's so many, there's so much stuff to discuss because Dale, initially you started talking about playing online, using virtual tabletops and D&D Beyond and tools like that, which is, almost its own separate discussion. Sean, do you use the digital tools, or do you prefer to keep physical, dice and character sheets and materials?
I played in a game at this convention where they had pre-generated characters, so I had a character sheet, and I still pulled up D&D Beyond to look at what the rules were around this 5e character.
Sure.
It doesn't tell me what this spell does, so I'll just look it up on D&D Beyond.
Yeah.
So yes, after having through 3rd edition and 4th edition to carry around a literal rolling suitcase full of books in order to run games at conventions, to be able to do it all from an iPad now, sold.
Yeah. And you know what else? Not even just in terms of play. I suppose this is something that just rose into my mind was that I have found from the perspective of someone who is designing stuff for a game system. So, for example, 5e. It's the archive that I have found the most useful. Having a digital archive that I can access. If I'm typing something on my laptop, I don't have to get up and walk across the room to where my books are. I can just look it up on D&D Beyond. And that has been so beyond useful. And that's for a system with minimal things like floating modifiers. For Pathfinder, sure. I know that 2e for Pathfinder has changed a lot of that. But Pathfinder is a lot more complex and granular in those kinds of rules. Having this thing that you can just pull up so quickly, that is a game changer in terms of when you're designing for the game, let alone when you're playing.
Yeah, I don't know.
I have not. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I have
James.
not hopped in because I spoke for the entire first segment. But I want to echo what Dale just said there, is that when it comes to reading a brand new D&D book, I will never do anything but have a comfy chair, a warm lamp, a hot cup of tea, and the physical book in my hands. But when I'm running games, I cannot imagine juggling even 3 books at the table, let alone all the supplements that have since come out in the game. I play most of my games online these days just kind of by necessity. My players, half of them live near me, the other half live down near Portland, Oregon. And so for Halloween, my whole party got together down around Portland. And even though we were all in person, the only thing that I ever thought about using was my laptop. I didn't bring a player's handbook or a monster manual or a DMG or any of the other billion monster supplements that I'm using. I'm just like, I need a Glabrizu demon. I'll type it in. and give it a go. And just so everyone is comfortable that, my personal history with D&D Beyond is not, sort of translating to me shilling for them again these days. I'll say this. If there's one thing that D&D Beyond could do a whole hell of a lot better, it's have a lot better search functionality, because that's the one thing I use it for the most, is searching for something. And its search functionality is functional.
Yeah.
I'll call it functional.
I always think it's really funny when I type in barbarian and it's like number 7 in the list. Just give me barbarian.
Yeah. The other important thing to note, I think, bringing this back to the Pathfinder Nexus news, is that this is being done by Demiplane, which is a company that Adam Bradford, who worked for D&D Beyond and left D&D Beyond to start Demiplane, is running Nexus.
D&D Beyond is his baby. There would be no D&D Beyond without Adam. Yeah,
exactly. So if you go to the current site for Nexus, it looks a lot like D&D Beyond for obvious reasons. I only say this because one of the things about technology is, does it work? And there were so many digital tools promised to us in 3rd edition and 4th edition and with other role-playing games that either imploded or didn't even get to the point where it could implode.
Do you remember Project Morningstar in early 5e?
Oh, just so many. And so I was so surprised when there was a company that actually pulled it off.
Sure.
That I was excited, and I thought, who is this that made this happen? And it was Adam and his team. So I would be very skeptical about this project if I didn't know that someone like Adam was behind it, to have the know-how to make it work.
Because I don't know if anybody, I've been trying to pull up the webpage, but my computer is being uncooperative. So I don't know if anybody knows this info or you've been reading it now, Sean. But the scope of Pathfinder Nexus is a little bit beyond even what D&D Beyond is, right? Like, aren't they talking about including some scope for online tools for playing online in terms of like digital maps and token inclusion? Am I remembering that correctly, or am I making that up?
I assume, just business-wise, I assume that's the case.
Okay.
I think I've heard that, so I would imagine that is true, yes.
Beep, 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 beep. Breaking unreliable news. Do your own reading. Yeah. Well, do we feel that, these digital tools are going to expand to other systems? Like, would you be excited to use a Vampire Masquerade, digital tool set?
I would be very surprised if other systems don't follow suit. I would be very surprised. I think we're going to get to the point where, for at least like the big established tabletop RPGs, maybe it won't be quite as simple to implement for indie stuff, but I think we're going to get to the point where new games, there will be an expectation that they have a digital system backing them up, to allow people to easily break that barrier of distance, if nothing else. I mean, it is tricky when it comes to indie game stuff. There are companies that do these sort of things. So, I published the Heroes and Villains of Theros with Jeremy Malul on DM's Guild, right? And that's indie stuff that we wrote, that we made up, but there are companies that we could work with that would make a Fantasy Grounds thing for that. That's great. But I do think that when we talk about, I'm trying to think of a bunch of indie games. I don't know, Kids on Bikes, right? Like, when you are kickstarting your game and you're a team of like 2 designers, do you have the capacity to sort of keep up with that digital tabletop space? I think is a separate question, but I think that more and more we're going to have the expectation that it has that sort of thing backing it up.
My sort of utopian technocrat guess is that more than just, indie games trying and failing or, being scoped out of digital tools probably won't happen so much as indie games will start developing with technology in mind. I mean, we've already seen it in things like Alice is Missing. That's a game based entirely around text message communication. I'm fascinated to see what sort of melding of digital and in-person unique sort of bespoke systems, rather than the sort of archive almanac that we see in terms of D&D Beyond or Pathfinder Nexus. What cool out-of-the-box stuff will indies do next? That's what indies do best, is take, the cutting edge technology and do something weird and kind of janky with it that eventually becomes that eventually becomes the industry standard, you know?
Well, that's like, you already see it with a melding of games that aren't really video games. They're kind of tabletop role-playing, well, maybe not role-playing games, but they're kind of like board games, but they need to be played digitally. And what I'm thinking of is Among Us, right? Like that is I know that people do play that text only. I can't imagine playing it text only, but then again, I have a group of friends. I'm in that fortunate position where I have a group of friends that enjoyed playing that repeatedly. But that game, it feels like Werewolf or Resistance, or Avalon or something like that.
Mafia.
Where exactly, it's a game that you kind of need other people to play. It has a tabletop vibe to it, even though it is an entirely digital game. So I wonder if there are going to be more of those, exactly like you said, James, where they start as a digital product and are kind of sold through Steam, but there's a in design social purpose to them that makes them more than a video game, kind of sitting somewhere between. Final quick bit of news here. This is really dumb. I just thought it was funny. Is that Games Workshop have announced a line of scented candles with
smell that grim dark future.
Yeah, exactly. with such scents as like the scent of delusion. Which, I think it's tongue in cheek. I don't think they're actually like, launching this as a dead serious. No, you want to smell delusion when you play your tabletop role playing games.
I just placed an order and received it from Cantrip Candles, who I think are kind of the premier D&D themed scented candle group. And I bought, let me see, I bought the Den of Thieves, which has a sort of musky, leathery sandalwood smell to it. And I bought Jardin de Fleurs, so it's flower garden. And, but they have other things like library and bakery and sanctuary, which is one of my favorite. They're all wonderful. There was one that I looked at. I looked at my housemate because, they were involved in this decision. I'm not going to buy a scented candle with a wild scent like bakery without saying, what do you think? They're dungeon.
Bakery, a wild scent.
Actually, they're
troglodyte done.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a dungeon scent that smells of moss, water, and dirt. And I thought, I wonder how many sales they get of this candle, because it sounds amazing for like gameplay ambiance, but I'm questioning whether or not I would light my dungeon or delusion scented candle just for regular day-to-day use.
But no, you say moss and dirt and like dripping water. That's like when I was a kid, we used to go to, anytime we went to the plant nursery, I would find myself in that little closed-in room with all the like pond plants, and that was my favorite room, and it had this incredible smell that I think is exactly what you just described, and now I want that candle.
You should get it. Maybe that is just kind of me speaking, because like living in the Pacific Northwest in late fall, I can go outside and smell
That's what
moss
it smells like.
and dirt and water, and like, oh, okay, yeah, there we are. That's what I smell every day. But I suppose if you're living in an Australian summer, that might be a scent that you don't get in your life too often.
Did anyone see? So Z Bashu made a video recently for Halloween that was discussing. We mentioned earlier the idea of being cursed in our dice rolls. And the video, it's an animation. It sort of ends up with them performing a ritual to get this ghost or this mathematical demon out of the person's body. And so they do it with, instead of having a pentagram on the floor, it's a D20.
Cute.
And then they had sage at every corner, but it was sage advice. And then they had a bell, but instead of it being a ring-a-ding bell, it was a bell from a game store. And I was saying, add to that Cantrip candles. That's the candles that you light for this ritual. It's perfect, and I need that ritual in writing so that I may perform it on myself.
Oh, I love that.
Sean, is this something you'd do? Light up a candle whenever you're running a game, just to get that extra level of immersion?
With the people I play with, we have to light a candle generally, so I hope they're watching. Yeah,
Dale was calling out her players.
Yeah.
Jeez,
you came for them more than I ever came for Daniel.
Daniel's like off the hook now.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not so much into the props. Even sounds for anything that gets in the way of my senses makes me lose focus rather than gain focus. So it's just a personal thing.
No, totally. I mean, I had never thought of scented candles before, but I do play music when I'm, running a game in a private setting and not in like a game store, for example. And I really like that for immersion, especially when you have, I think it's super effective when you have, like a PC has died or an NPC that was important to the party has died, or, maybe it's not even death, but just some sort of loss has occurred, and you play that like sad music, and it just puts everybody right in that frame of mind where they get immersed in the game. But it's interesting to hear you say that, Sean, because I agree. There are, I think that VR kind of stand up and play, with the motion controls, a kind of an example of something that is meant to make gaming, and in this case, video gaming, more immersive. But I actually find it to be less immersive because I'm standing up and like running around rather than like focusing on being immersed within the game. So
yeah.
That's interesting. Last but not least, we did have an email this week with somebody asking us about the concept of hit points. This email comes in from Remy, and Remy asks, and I've seen this around a bit on Twitter as well, are hit points meat? Are they the physical health of a character, or do they represent things like armor, luck, agility to avoid mortal blows? Is there a way that we describe hit points in the games that we run that is different from just, you lose 7 hit points, you get hit, you're bleeding a bit, but you're okay for the time being because you still have 14 more? Dale, I'm fascinated to know what your approach to hit points damage is, especially as the players level up and they get like 57 hit points and they're taking all sorts of damage before it even starts to affect them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my thoughts on it probably align with a lot of people's, in that hit points are meant to represent a lot of things. It's an abstract concept that is just representing you are getting closer and closer to death in this fight. I mean, I have found myself from time to time describing it as being a hit point is, the damage you would take if a peasant punched you. They hit you and you take 1 point of damage. It's a hit point. And I'm so into this idea of describing it as like near misses or glancing blows, or, you're getting tired, you're losing endurance. I've played around with the idea of, you look at video games like Halo, right? And you get shot a lot, but the idea is that the armor is catching all these bullets, but then it has to recharge. And if you lose all your armor in that moment, then you start actually losing hit points. So there's, abstractions of the health system that would say, okay, only once you hit 20 health points or below are you actually taking damage. But I think that the problem is that once you actually get to the table, once you're actually playing the game, players naturally want to describe it, and you as the DM often naturally want to describe it as cuts and blood and like, you did this thing and they're burned, you burned them on their face, right? Like, you just naturally start describing it as physical damage, and it all sort of starts the abstraction. You can believe in the abstraction concept as much as you want, but it starts to fall apart when you're actually playing, because you want to be like, you stabbed them with your sword. I don't know, maybe that's down to damage types existing. You can't say you take 4 exhaustion points from acid. Like, it doesn't quite. Anyway.
Exhaustion as a damage type instead of like its own separate mechanic. Now there's a whole.
Oh no, I've given him ideas.
Conversation. Yeah. I mean, I fall into that exact trap where I've had players say to me like, it doesn't make sense that I keep getting hit by arrows, but like 3 minutes later I'm totally fine after a short rest. But I think it's a Colville thing where he said that it's fun. He was talking about armor classes, but he said it's fun to hit things. And so in game, when you're describing even the players hitting a goblin, you don't want the player to hit, but then you describe it as a miss, but the goblin gets a bit more tired. Like, that's a bit less fun in the...
Yeah, you miss enough. You miss often enough. You don't want your hits to also be misses.
Exactly. Sean, what about you? What's your approach to this?
Well, D&D is a resource management game, and it is a tool for which we can tell great narrative stories. And sometimes there's a dissonance between those two things, and that's exactly what hit points are, because we want them to be a certain thing, but they're not that thing in the story. When you can insult a goblin to death you realize that it's not just the damage that you take. So yeah, I mean that's what it narrows, comes down to me. You get games like Fate where you can take consequences rather than dying. So your hit points are called stress. And so you can take stress from physical blows or from mental blows. And then you can also write off the damage you take with something called consequences. And so you might take 2 points off for a mild consequence, and then you name that consequence. And that becomes an ongoing trait that you have until you are able to erase that consequence. So maybe it's, I have a broken knee now. And that becomes a part of the game that the game master can use against you, or that you can use to get more fate points if you play it up. And so that's something that a different game uses to make these hit points seem more narrative than just this consequence or this numerical thing, where if you have 100 hit points and you have 1 hit point, it really doesn't change what you can do. It really doesn't change how you are. It might change your tactics, but it doesn't change what you are physically able to do. But if you go from 1 to 0, then everything changes. So it's that dissonance between the game mechanics and the narrative we want to tell using those game mechanics that make hit point this wibbly wobbly sort of thing that's impossible to define.
Yeah, totally. James, anything to add?
I wonder what a game in which hit points were meat would be like. Every time you leveled up, you gained more meat.
Everybody's a barbarian. They're just slowly packing it on.
What's this sort of Cronenbergian horror game we've just developed where you gain more sort of bulk?
Yeah. Or a deli.
You just sort of put hams, tie them to your arms.
That's your armor now.
I mean, I don't entirely know where this expression comes from, but I've heard it around a lot, particularly on Twitter before, is like spoons. How many spoons do you have left
Your sort of mental health.
Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe if we devise some sort of game where spoons were your hit point kind of thing to raise and lower as you played the game.
Maybe magic users should use spoons instead of hit points.
That's a very sort of Discworld idea, I feel. So I think that, Sean, you're absolutely right. There's a dissonance between the gameplay and the narrative there. Did one of us say, did I say ludonarrative dissonance on a previous episode?
I did.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a ludonarrative dissonance. And sometimes it can be very fun to try and iron out the dissonance in the most literal way possible and see what happens. If you iron out the dissonance of hit points, you get people who can physically take more and more blows that would kill a normal man as they grow in XP, however you want to realize that abstraction of XP, which is just another sort of layer to this layer cake. And I think if you read it that way, there becomes a very clear thesis about the kind of game D&D is meant to be, where you kind of go from being pitchfork-wielding peasants into demigods who can, take a dagger to the heart like it's just how you take your coffee, simply by sort of killing things until they die, and you kind of take that power into yourself. That's a very interesting game once you play with that premise very literally in mind. I think there's a whole story to be taken there of some kind of almost Highlander-esque situation where normal people, through the sort of gathering of power, through the murder of other sentient beings, become nigh unkillable monsters themselves.
Can you play a lawful good character in that game? Question for another time. That is the podcast for today. Thank you so much for that email, Remy. If you want to keep the conversation going, our Twitter handles are just below our names if you're watching this on YouTube, and you can reach out to us there. Otherwise, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Send us a question. Ask us to elaborate on something we've discussed before. Anything and everything. I will grab out some and we will put it to the panel here today. Thank you so much for listening. Let everybody know about the podcast. Go into your local tavern and let the fellow adventurers know that the Eldritch Lorecast is here every week. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin, James Hake, and our fifth member, the next door neighbour's dog. Thank you so much, everybody. We will catch you next time.